Week 9 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 36 wide receivers. I'm ranking this week number 1, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. So Tyreek Hill, what a season it's been for him. Already 1,000 yards through 8 weeks of the season. And this week here versus former team, the Kansas City Chiefs, in Germany in front of a big crowd. I think he has a monster game once again. And he's won number 2, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So A.J. Brown, first few weeks he was struggling, and ever since then, 125 yards, plus the last 6 games to break an NFL record in each ball game. So this week here, I know it's versus a tough Dallas Cowboy defense, but A.J. Brown, a physical wide receiver, guy can make all the plays, run all the routes. And this week, even versus a tough D, I got him at 2. Number 3, Stephon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills. So Stephon Diggs, it's been a solid season for him once again. And him and Josh Allen, it's good to see them on the same page. He could run all the routes, obviously, and Josh Allen could throw it a country mile. So this week here at Cincinnati, in a potential shootout between 2 of the top 3 teams in the league, in my opinion, I got him at 3, 4, staying in the same game, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Jamar Chase, he got off to a slow start in the last month of the season. He's been one of the top wide receivers in fantasy football, and we know he's a great route runner. We know he could burn right by you, and this week we know it's a tougher matchup versus the Bills, but their secondary obviously banged up with Tre'Davious White out for the season, and this game has high potential shootout written all over it. Number 5, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. So CeeDee Lamb, the last few weeks, he's really stepped up his game after putting up pedestrian numbers for the majority of the season, and him and Dak Prescott have had a talk after that Week 5 loss in that one where they got blown out at the San Francisco 49ers. And ever since then, he's had 2 100-yard games, Week 6 at the Chargers, and then last week exploding with over 40 fantasy points for CeeDee Lamb. So this week, a tougher matchup and a big division matchup for the Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles. But CeeDee Lamb, like I said, he's playing out of this world the last few weeks. And I got him at 5, 6, Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. I know Cooper Kupp, it's been quiet last 2 weeks for him, but this week a better matchup at the Green Bay Packers. I know Brett Rypien might start in this game, where we know his experience hasn't been great throughout his NFL career, and it's a downgrade from Matthew Stafford. But Cooper Kupp, with a younger quarterback and a guy who obviously doesn't have a lot of experience, I think those shorter routes and underneath routes, he could rack up really a lot in this game here instead of taking chances down the field. So actually, with Rypien and quarterback Cooper Kupp, it might help him out get on back track a little bit quicker with the underneath stuff. Number 7, Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. So over the last few weeks, Allen and Herbert, they're just missing on some big plays here for this Los Angeles Charger team and fantasy owners. I know this week it's a tough matchup at the New York Jets, but Keenan Allen, top 5 in receptions at the position. He can run all the routes. We know he's a good player. And I think this week in a grinded-out type of ball game, a lot of underneath routes, a lot of short passes and trying yards after catch to get things going versus your team. And I got him at 7. Number 8, Adam Thielen, Carolina Panthers. Adam Thielen, pretty much the only bright spot on the offense here for this Carolina Panther team. He's another great route runner, and a lot of people thought he was washed up, including the Minnesota Vikings last season, releasing him. But right now, he's top 10 in fantasy points, is Thielen. It seems like each and every week he finds the end zone. And this week here versus a mediocre to poor defense of the Indianapolis Colts coming to town, I think Adam Thielen once again has a good ball game, and I got him at 8. Number 9, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Mike Evans off to a way greater start than he was last season with Tom Brady at quarterback. And him and Baker Mayfield, they're just hitting on big plays, and Baker's finding them in the red zone and the end zone. So last week, I know it wasn't a great game for Mike Evans, but he did salvage and finish with a touchdown at the end. So this week here versus a young Houston secondary, even though their defense has been pretty stout season, I got him at 9. Number 10, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So Waddle, the last 2 weeks, he's starting to get things going after coming out of the gate slow, is Waddle. And we know he's a great wide receiver. Last year, over 1,300 yards receiving. And this week here in a big AFC matchup with the Miami Dolphins and the Kansas City Chiefs, I think we're going to see a lot of scoring. And like I said, Waddle the last couple weeks has put up some big numbers. 11, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. And Michael Pittman, he's been playing great football with Gardner Minshew. Gardner's getting them the football in places. He's hitting them on the deep ball, and he's finding the end zone. And Gardner Minshew, we know he's a gunslinger, but if it's one thing, he gets the ball to his wide receivers and Pittman and Josh Downs. So this week in a good matchup at the Carolina Panthers, where their secondary isn't all that great. Pittman has a good game. 12, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Smith last week finally had a breakout performance after the last 3-4 weeks he didn't do much. And Smith, I know he's a boom or bust type of wide receiver, but this week here versus the Dallas Cowboy defense, where the secondary does take a lot of gambles with the ball hawking ability, trying to make a big pick or a big hit, I think Smith could catch a deep ball in this one, and him and Jalen Hurts have a great rapport. This offense is a well-oiled machine, and I think Smith does hit on a big play in this one, and that's why I got him at 12-13. Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. I know Olave, it hasn't been that great of a season so far for him, even though Derek Carr the last 3 weeks has thrown over 300 yards. But this week here, I think everything turns around for Olave. I think he goes for a nice game versus one of the worst defenses in the league and a young secondary of the Chicago Bears. And we saw last week with the Chargers, had a crazy offensive output. And I think Olave indoors versus this Chicago Bear team has a good game at home. For the Saints team, 14, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. I know Garrett Wilson, he's been a great wide receiver, and I know his numbers have been limited a little bit as well with Zach Wilson, who just can't get the football down the field or score points for this Jet team. But right now, a great matchup versus the Chargers, where their defense hasn't been all that great versus the past this season, even though last week they held in check DJ Moore. So right now, Garrett Wilson's a talented wide receiver. He could run the routes. He could go up there, get the jump ball. And this week here on Monday Night Football in a big ball game, I think this is where he steps up once again and has a good game. 15, Puka Nacua of Los Angeles Rams. I know Nacua's banged up with a knee injury, and we don't know 100% if he's going to play, but I think he plays in this game. And even with a backup quarterback, Nacua, we know, is a possession receiver. If Brett Rypien does start in this game, a lot of underneath routes and short routes to get this offense moving and safe plays. And this week here, it's at a Green Bay Packer team where their pass defense isn't all that good. With Jordan Addison last week had a good game. Amon St. Brown a few weeks ago had a great game as well. And I don't think they really could stop Nacua or Cooper Kupp for the most part. 16, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore, one of the better route runners in the league, and a guy up there in yards after catch this season. So DJ Moore, we know a few weeks ago on Thursday night, had a monster 230-yard, 3-touchdown game at the Washington Commanders. So this week here, another indoor game. I know the last 2 weeks with Tyson Beckett at quarterback, DJ Moore's numbers definitely went down, and rightfully so, but he's still putting up serviceable numbers. 10, 15 fantasy points pretty much weekly at worst he's going to get for fantasy owners. And this week here versus a leaky secondary of the Saints, I got him at 16, 17, DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans. So DeAndre Hopkins finally had that patented breakout game, and he could still run the routes and burn you down the field as Hopkins. He just needs the quarterback that could stretch the field, and Will Levis came in, started that game versus the Falcons, and that's what happened. So this week here, good matchup at the Pittsburgh Steelers, where they give up a decent amount of fantasy points to receivers on the season. Minkah Fitzpatrick most likely out in this game. We saw Calvin Ridley have a good game last week, and Christian Kirk a decent one. And Will Levis, if he could stretch the field once again and keep this chemistry going with Hopkins, this guy could jump up the rankings even quicker in the next few weeks. 18, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So Terry McLaurin, one of the most underrated receivers in the league. And week in and week out, he puts up numbers, he makes plays. Him and Sam Howell have a good chemistry, good rapport. This week, it's a good matchup with a banged-up secondary of the New England Patriots. And McLaurin, he's pretty much a solid number 2 wide receiver, flex option, weekly. 19, Devonte Adams of the Vegas Raiders. So Devonte Adams, he could have had a monster game on Monday Night Football in Week 8 versus at the Lions, but it just couldn't happen. Garoppolo missed him on a couple deep balls down the sidelines where they couldn't connect. Adams early in the game dropped a nice slant route that would have been a first down. And these guys haven't been on the same page, and the numbers have dropped off for Adams mightily over the last few weeks here. And I know he's not 100% as well with a wrist injury and shoulder problem. But right now, this week, a good matchup versus the Giants, a young secondary. I know the Giants defense has played way better the last 3 weeks of the season. But Adams, he's due for a big ball game. And it wouldn't be surprising to me if he has a big game and everything's forgotten for the most part. Even though I have a feeling he does one out of Las Vegas after the year. Number 20, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. It was good to see T. Higgins have a nice solid game in last week's victory at the San Francisco 49ers. And it was doom and gloom the first 4 weeks of the season for this Bengal team. But now the last 3 weeks, things have turned around. Jamar Chase is putting up huge numbers. T. Higgins is back to being a solid number 2 wide receiver. And Joe Burrow's healthy. So this week here with AFC top teams in this matchup, in a potential shootout on Sunday Night Football versus Buffalo, even though they're a good defense, I got them at 20-21. Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So it's been a solid rookie season for Flowers. I know he's coming off a bad game last week at Arizona, but it was about the running game and Gus Edwards in that one. So this week here, good matchup versus Seattle Seahawks. I know they got a good secondary, but it's a young secondary and they still give up some big plays. So Flowers and the Ravens, this is a big matchup here with the 5-2 Seahawks coming to town. But like I said, Flowers, they use him in a lot of roles. There's going to be some great games and some games like last week where he didn't do much. But this week versus Seattle, I think he's decent. 22, Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers, so one of the better possession wide receiver and PPR receivers in the league when everything goes right. I know Kenny Pickett might not start this game. He's banged up with the shoulder injury. Might be Mitchell Trubisky. But Deontay Johnson, like I said, as long as you can get the ball in his vicinity, he's going to catch the football. And this week it's a solid matchup, I believe, here versus the Tennessee Titans, where they give up a lot of passing yards on the season. They're good versus the run, but in terms of pass and catching by the wide receiver, you could put points up on Tennessee. So even if it's Trubisky or Pickett, I think Johnson carves out a number 2 wide receiver number this week. 23, DK Metcalf. The Seattle Seahawks, him and Geno Smith, they're just missing on a big play or two here gamely, it seems like. So Metcalf, he's another player due. I know it's a tougher matchup, but one of the better defenses season at the Baltimore Ravens, even though they've been banged up the majority of the season. But DK Metcalf, we know he's a physical specimen. We know he can run the routes. We know he can get the jump ball. But it's just about him and Geno Smith connecting on that deep ball and making big plays down the middle of the field. So this week here, DK Metcalf, he's definitely dropping down the rankings weekly where he's topping out 10, 13 fantasy points at most. So this week, 23, 24, Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts. So Josh Downs, he's bumping up that ranking board quickly over the last 3 weeks. Weeks ago, he wasn't even owned in more than 10% of fantasy leagues, and now he's the number 2 wide receiver over here for Indianapolis. Seems like weekly he's scoring a touchdown or at least 12 or more fantasy points. And this week he had a good matchup with the Carolina Panthers that give up a lot of points to wide receivers on the season and really haven't stopped anyone. I got him at 24, 25, another rookie, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So Jordan Addison, he was on the verge of a huge season where he was a top 10 wide receiver weekly, but now with Kirk Cousins out for the season with a torn Achilles, and now Jaron Hall going to be the starter this week, and next week possibly Joshua Dobbs will step into the role. His numbers are going to take a hit, obviously, but already 7 touchdowns on the season, and like I said, he had top 10 potential if Cousins stayed healthy. So this week he had a tougher matchup at the Falcons that have been good versus the pass all season, besides last week where Hopkins torched him and Will Levis. I got him at 25, 26, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. And Nico Collins, it's been a weird season for him. We've seen some monster games over 30 fantasy points, and then we've seen games like last week where he's scoring 7-8 fantasy points, but last week it was just a bad game overall and you forget about it, and hopefully this week he bounces back versus Tampa Bay secondary, which isn't all that great. We saw Gabe Davis torch them last week. Collins, throughout his career, has been a better player at home than he is on the road, and this week I think he bounces back versus Tampa Bay, and he's a solid 2 flex option. 27, Chris Godwin staying in the same game of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Chris Godwin, we know, is one of the better possession and PPR receivers in the league in terms of catching the football, but in terms of putting up touchdowns and yards, it hasn't been all that great this season. But him and Baker Mayfield weekly, it seems like they're starting to build a rapport and get things going. So this week here versus a young Houston secondary, I think Godwin once again has a 12, 14-point game. 28, Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. So Lockett, he was due for a breakout game, and last week he finally hit in that one versus the Cleveland Browns. So this week a tougher matchup at the Baltimore Ravens. 2 top teams in their conferences, and they're playing great football. Him and Geno Smith, they just got to connect as well. Geno's just missing the season with Metcalf and Lockett on big plays. Last season it was there. This year it hasn't been there weekly, but this week as the number 3 wide receiver, Lockett could be a decent option. 29, Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills. So Gabe Davis, he's a boom or bust wide receiver totally. 1 week it would be 3 fantasy points, and then last week 23 fantasy points. So that's been the trend for Davis. So this week here, he's got a matchup at a beatable Cincinnati secondary. We know this is going to be a potential shootout, 50-60 total points possibly between the 2 teams. Well, like I said, we don't know which Gabe Davis it's going to be in this one. And with Dalton Kincaid being a big part of the offense now and getting more targets as well, Davis could take a hit, but I got him at 29, 30, Jacoby Myers of the Vegas Raiders. So Myers, he had a nice 3-week stretch where he was finding the end zone and putting up anywhere from 16 to 20 fantasy points. It's a good matchup versus the Giants. With his secondary, it's played better, no doubt about it, the last few weeks, but they still got young players in that secondary as well. And Jacoby Myers, he's a solid route runner and a good receiver yards after catch as well. But this week, he's a flex to 3 option. 31, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Pickens last week, he only had 1 catch and it was a touchdown. That salvaged his day. So this week here, it's a good matchup on paper versus the Titans that are vulnerable versus the pass and give up top 10 numbers to wide receivers in fantasy points this season. But like I said, George Pickens, it's been up and down with him. There's some monster games he's had in some games like last week where a touchdown saves his day. Pickens, if it's going to be Pickett, he's not going to be 100% throwing the football. And if it's Trubisky, him and Trubisky really haven't had chemistry over the last season, where Pickens last year played a bunch of games with Trubisky and didn't do much. This week I got him at 31, 32, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's the number 1 wide receiver, in my opinion, here is Rashee Rice for this Chiefs team. I say it every week, Sky Moore's done nothing this season. Kadarius Toney hasn't done anything. Valdez-Scantlin's more of the deep ball threat, and Watson's a deep ball threat as well. But Rashee Rice, he's the more complete wide receiver on this team, and they need him to step up. So this week here, I know the Dolphins secondary got reinforcements the last couple weeks with Jalen Ramsey back last week and Xavier Howard back as well here. But anyway, Rashee Rice in an offense with Patrick Mahomes with your quarterback, he's still a viable option. 33, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. So Amari Cooper's definitely falling down the rankings a lot, and it's not 100% his fault. P.J. Walker hasn't been a quarterback that can consistently get the football to his wide receivers, and he's been a turnover machine as well over the last few weeks. And even Deshaun Watson and Cooper had some up and down. So this week, I know it's a good matchup versus a Cardinal defense that can't stop anyone. But right now, Amari Cooper's been struggling lately, and throughout his career, there's games where he disappears, and we've seen it with the Raiders and the Dallas Cowboys, and a lot this season as well. 34, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. London took a big hit where he got the wind knocked out of him and a potential concussion in last week's ball game at the Tennessee Titans. But this week here, it's a good matchup on paper versus the Minnesota Vikings, but London's been one of the more inconsistent wide receivers this season. I know he had a 125-yard ball game a few weeks ago, and then there's a game where he comes in and he don't do much the next week. So he's a Jekyll and Hyde, boomer bust type of wide receiver. And now, not being 100%, I got him at 34. 35, Hollywood Brown of the Arizona Cardinals. So Hollywood Brown, for the most part this season, he's been a consistent wide receiver, scoring 15 or more fantasy points in 4 games this year. But this week, a tougher matchup at the Cleveland Browns. Denzel Ward, one of the best corners in the league, most likely will be shadowing Hollywood Brown. And with Kyler Murray coming back possibly, or Clayton Tune being the starting quarterback, I don't like any of those guys consistently getting the football to Hollywood Brown in this matchup. And this week here, he's a number 3 receiver or flex option at best, and the 36th and final wide receiver on rankings. Brandon Cooks of the Dallas Cowboys. So Cooks, the first 6 weeks of the season, pretty much wasn't a factor, but the last 2 games he's gone out there and he scored touchdowns for this Cowboy team. And this Cowboy team traded for him for a reason. A guy who could take the safety over the top, stretch the field, get things open for Ferguson and CeeDee Lamb, and also a burner who could burn a secondary and get the deep ball. So him and Dak Prescott definitely have built the chemistry over the last few weeks. And Brandon Cooks, we know each and every season's pretty much been a 1,000-yard receiver throughout his career. So this week in a game where I think Philly stops the run and forces Dak Prescott to try to beat him, I think Brandon Cooks put numbers up in this one, and I got him at 36. That's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking here for week 9 of the fantasy football season.